I had been an usher at the Aldermere Concert Hall for 30 years, and in that time I had learned to read a room the way the tuners read a piano, by ear, by feel, by the small sounds nobody else thought worth noticing. So when I tell you that the night Josephine Calloway sat down at our Bosendorfer was the strangest, finest thing I ever witnessed inside those walls, you can trust that I have something to compare it to. She wasn't a performer. She was the tuner's girl, though by then she wasn't a girl anymore. She was 22, with her grandfather's careful hands and a way of tilting her head toward a piano as if it might whisper something to her if she waited long enough. Old Mr. Calloway had tuned that Bosendorfer for 40 years before his eyes gave out entirely, and when he could no longer see the hammers, Josie had taken over the work without anyone making a fuss about it. She came in the afternoons before the evening concerts, alone, with her case of felted mutes and her tuning forks, and she left before the gala crowd arrived. That was the arrangement. Nobody had ever suggested otherwise. I'd watched her work often enough to know her habits. She always started in the bass and worked upward, striking a key, leaning close to listen, adjusting the pin with a patience that made the rest of the staff look hurried by comparison. She wore the same dark cardigan most weeks, soft at the elbows, and kept a folded handkerchief tucked in the cuff for wiping rosewood dust from the lid. She rarely spoke to anyone beyond a polite nod, and most of the gala regulars had stopped noticing her entirely, the way you stop noticing the chairs are there until you need to sit in one. The night I'm telling you about was a fundraising gala, the kind where the foyer fills early with patrons in evening dress holding champagne they don't finish, waiting for the doors to the hall to open. Josie had stayed past her usual hour, the piano's upper register had given her trouble, something in the dampers, and she didn't want to leave it unfinished. I watched her from my post near the cloakroom. When she'd closed the lid and gathered her tools, she paused. Just paused, her hand resting flat on the piano's closed lid the way you'd rest a hand on a shoulder. That was when Maestro Philip Renner came through the foyer. He was the hall's resident concert pianist, had been for 9 years, and he carried himself the way men do when they've been told too often that they are gifted. He saw her hand on the piano and he stopped. "Something to say to my instrument," he said, loud enough that the nearest cluster of patrons turned. Josie straightened. "I was only finishing the tuning, Maestro." "Were you?" He looked at her case, her plain dark cardigan, the chalk dust on her sleeve from the hall's old felts. A small, unkind smile found his mouth. "You linger here every week like the keys might teach you something. Go on, then." He gestured at the bench with a flourish meant for the crowd, not for her. "Play something simple. Since you clearly think you're entitled to sit there." A ripple of laughter went through the patrons nearby, not cruel, exactly, but the kind of laughter that comes from people who have decided in advance what the joke will be. Someone near the bar set down a tray of empty glasses to watch. A woman in a beaded shawl leaned toward her companion and murmured something I couldn't catch, and her companion smiled the particular smile of someone settling in for a bit of harmless sport. Renner had an audience now, and he knew it, the way performers always know it, some instinct in the shoulders that tells them the room has turned its attention their way. He folded his arms and waited with the patient, theatrical air of a man who has already decided how the scene will end. I expected her to apologize and leave. I have seen that scene before, more times than I can count, and it almost always ends with the help backing away, eyes down, the moment swallowed whole, the patrons returning to their champagne within a minute, already forgetting there had been anything to forget. Josie didn't move for a long second. Then she set her tool case on the floor, and sat. The foyer had gone quiet in the particular way crowds go quiet when they expect to be entertained at someone else's expense. Renner crossed his arms and waited, already composing, I think, the gracious little laugh he meant to give once she'd embarrassed herself. Her hands found the keys without looking down at them. That was the first thing I noticed. She wasn't watching her fingers, she was tilting her head the way her grandfather used to, listening to a piano he could no longer see. The first note was so soft I almost missed it under the room's murmuring. The second note answered it. By the fourth, the foyer had stopped murmuring entirely. It was the opening of a Chopin ballade, the G minor, the one that begins like a question being asked very gently, almost to itself. I knew it because Mr. Calloway used to hum it while he worked, decades ago, back when his eyes still served him and he'd sometimes play a few bars himself to test the action of a key. I hadn't heard it played in that hall in years. Josie played it the way her grandfather used to hum it. Not from the page, There was no page, nothing on the music stand at all, but from somewhere older than reading, the way you know the shape of your own name. Her phrasing had his unmistakable patience in it, the way he never rushed a phrase even when the music wanted him to. She let the silences between the opening notes breathe, the way a good storyteller lets a pause do half the work, and the pedal beneath her foot rose and fell so gently I had to watch to be sure she was using it at all. Renner's arms had come uncrossed. He was staring at her hands now, and his expression had gone from amused to something else, the look of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the moment he was standing in. I saw him glance once at the music stand, empty as it was, as if checking for a trick, and finding none. The ballade builds the way a held breath builds, and Josie let it build. The patrons who had laughed moments before were drifting closer now, drinks forgotten in their hands, faces tilted toward the piano the way flowers tilt toward a window. Somewhere behind me I heard a woman whisper, "Who is that?" and nobody answered her because nobody knew, and the not knowing only made the room lean in further. A waiter stood frozen halfway across the foyer with a tray balanced on one palm, forgotten entirely. When the music turned, when the ballade left its quiet opening and rose into the cascading, turbulent passage that demands everything a pianist has, Josie's whole posture changed. Her shoulders dropped. Her head came up. For the first time since she'd sat down, she looked like she'd forgotten anyone was watching at all, as if the foyer and the patrons and Renner himself had simply dissolved around her and left only the Bosendorfer and the music it had been waiting all evening to make. I have ushered patrons into that hall for 30 years to hear trained virtuosos perform under stage lights with programs printed on heavy cream paper, and I had never once seen a room hold its breath the way that foyer held its breath for a tuner's girl in a chalk-dusted cardigan. The chords came faster now, urgent, climbing, her right hand racing through a passage that should have required years of stage seasoning to play with that kind of nerve, and underneath the technical fire of it, there was something else, something I can only describe as grief finding its voice after a long silence. I didn't know yet what that grief was. I only knew it was real, because I felt my own throat tighten without understanding why, and beside me an elderly gentleman I'd seated 100 times before quietly took out a handkerchief and didn't bother hiding what it was for. Renner had gone very still. He was a man who critiqued performances for a living, who could find fault in a phrase the way other men find fault in a stranger's driving, and he had nothing. His mouth had opened slightly, as if to speak, and then simply stayed that way, forgotten. The ballade reached its final descent, the long, falling cascade that Chopin wrote to sound like a question finally answered, though not happily, not unhappily, just answered, and Josie's hand slowed with it, note by note, until the last chord hung in the air and she let it die completely before she lifted her hands from the keys. For a moment nobody breathed. I have never, in 30 years, heard a foyer that full and that silent. Then someone near the back, I think it was the chairwoman of the hall's board, a woman not given to displays, began to clap, and the sound spread through the crowd like a struck match catching dry kindling, until the whole foyer was on its feet, glasses set down on every available surface, applause rolling up toward the painted ceiling. Josie sat with her hands still resting on the keys, blinking like someone waking from a dream she hadn't meant to fall into. Renner was the last to move. When he finally did, he didn't clap. He walked to the piano, slowly, the whole room watching him do it, and he held out his hand, not as a maestro extending a courtesy, but the way you'd offer a hand to someone you'd misjudged badly and didn't know how to apologize to in words. Josie hesitated, then took it, and let him help her up from the bench, and that was the whole of his apology. He never said a word. He didn't need to. His face had already said everything there was to say. It was the hall's stage manager, of all people, who finally asked her the question we were all thinking. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Josie looked down at the piano, at her own hands, as if she were as surprised by them as the rest of us. "My grandfather taught me," she said. "He tuned this piano for 40 years. He went blind before I was 10, but he never stopped playing, he just stopped needing to see the keys. He taught me everything by ear, sitting beside him on this bench, after the hall closed for the night. He always said a piano doesn't care if you can read music. It only cares if you're listening." She paused, and her voice caught slightly. "He passed in the spring. This was the last piece I ever heard him play. I haven't played it again until tonight. I don't know what made me sit down." Nobody in that foyer spoke for a long moment. I looked at Renner and saw something in him I'd never seen in 9 years of watching him walk through that hall like he owned every inch of it, a kind of humility settling over his face the way dust settles after something has fallen. The gala performance went ahead that night as scheduled, with Renner at the piano under the proper stage lights, programs in everyone's laps. But I noticed, before he walked out to take his bow, that he stopped by the Feuer Bosendorfer one more time, and rested his hand flat against its closed lid, the very gesture he'd mocked in Josie not an hour before, and stood there a moment, alone, before he went out to play. I don't know if he ever told anyone what he was thinking in that moment. I don't need to know. I was there, and I saw a proud man learn, in the space of 4 minutes, that the truest music in that hall had never come from the stage at all. It had come from the girl nobody thought to listen for, playing the only way she knew how, by ear, by feel, by love, the way her grandfather had taught her in the quiet after closing, when nobody was there to laugh. Word of that night spread through the hall in the way things do among staff who keep its long hours, quietly, over weeks, in the kitchens and the cloakrooms and the narrow stairs behind the stage. I heard later that Renner had asked the board to let Josie play a short piece before the opening of every gala that season, not as a tuner stepping aside from her work but as a guest the hall was proud to introduce. She accepted, on the condition that she still be allowed to do her own tuning first, in the quiet, the way she always had. Some things, I gathered, she wasn't willing to give up. I have ushered a great many performances since that night, and I expect I'll usher a great many more before I'm through. But when people ask me, as they sometimes do, what the finest thing I ever heard in that hall was, I never name a single one of the famous names who've played there. I tell them about a tuner's girl, a closed lid, and a ballade that taught an entire room how to listen again.